Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness saves a life in ways we'll never see coming. We often think it takes a fortune, a breakthrough, or a miracle of science to pull someone back from the edge. But what if I told you it could be something far simpler? A quiet gesture, a listening ear, or even a bowl of soup, made with love. In the heart of a bustling city stood a mansion of glass and steel, rising like a monument to success. It was the home of Richard Alston, a billionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms, newspapers, and social circles across the world. To outsiders, Richard seemed untouchable. He had everything. 10 gleaming luxury cars lined his driveway like trophies. His face graced the glossy covers of magazines, and at every high-class gathering, whispers followed him like shadows. Power, money, influence. Richard appeared to have conquered it all, but what the world didn't see was the one thing money could never protect him from: the frailty of his own body. Behind closed doors, where the chandeliers hung heavy and the marble floors echoed silence, Richard was fighting a losing battle. For years, he had lived a life of excess, numbing his loneliness with work and wealth, and for years, the finest doctors in the world had kept him going, one pill, one procedure, one consultation at a time, until one day, even the most advanced medicine could do no more. His condition worsened without warning. Specialists were flown in from every corner of the globe, 10 of the most acclaimed doctors, each carrying the authority of decades of experience and armed with cutting-edge treatments. They came in with confidence, with charts and machines, with a determination to save the billionaire who seemed too important to fail. But as one day blurred into the next, their hope began to fade. Each doctor left Richard's lavish bedroom with the same shaken head, the same hushed tone of defeat. The prescriptions and tests did little. The man who once commanded entire industries was growing weaker by the hour, his once powerful voice now just a whisper of frustration. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, in the quiet corners of the mansion where no cameras ever looked, there was someone else, someone the world never noticed, but who had been there all along. Her name was Evelyn. Evelyn had been Richard's housekeeper for over 20 years. She was a woman in her late 50s, with gentle hands worn by work and eyes that had seen both hardship and grace. To the world outside, she was invisible, never photographed at the mansion's extravagant parties, never mentioned in society columns, never even acknowledged by the guests who swept through the Alston home. But Evelyn had seen Richard in ways no journalist or business partner ever had. She had seen him slam doors in anger. She had seen him celebrate deals worth millions, and she had seen him sit alone, staring at his reflection in the tall glass windows. When the parties ended and the noise faded, Evelyn came from humble beginnings, a black woman who had worked tirelessly to support her children. She knew the weight of long nights and empty wallets. She knew what it meant to work hard, to be overlooked, to survive on perseverance and prayer. And through it all, she had come to believe in something money could never buy: the healing power of kindness. While the doctors focused on Richard's charts, his blood tests, his machines, Evelyn noticed something else. She noticed that Richard had not truly connected with another human being in months. Yes, he was surrounded by people, but they spoke in medical jargon, not in comfort. They treated his illness, but not his loneliness, and loneliness can be just as deadly as any disease. Each evening, Evelyn would tidy his room after the doctors left. She would quietly pick up the untouched trays of food, the scattered notes, the pills lined up in neat rows. She would glance at Richard, frail in his bed, and though she was just the housekeeper, her heart ached for the man who seemed surrounded by everything but love. This is where our story begins, with a man who thought he had everything, yet was losing the one thing that mattered most, and a woman whose quiet compassion was about to change his life in ways no one could have predicted. Before I continue, I want to pause and say something from the heart. I've worked hard to bring this story to you, weaving it together with the hope that it inspires you to believe in the power of kindness. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe the world needs more reminders of compassion, more proof that love still makes a difference, I'd be deeply grateful if you subscribe to this channel. It helps me keep telling stories like this, and it tells the world that kindness truly matters. Now, let's step deeper into the story, because while 10 doctors could not save Richard Alston, one woman's simple gesture was about to succeed where medicine had failed. That evening, after another long day of specialists rushing in and out with little progress, Evelyn lingered near the kitchen. The house was silent, heavy with the weight of despair. The doctors had left with lowered eyes, whispering to Richard's family about how little more could be done. The air in the mansion felt colder than ever. Evelyn looked at the untouched dinner tray. The finest chefs had prepared it, garnished with herbs flown in from overseas, plated on porcelain worth more than she made in a week. But Richard hadn't eaten a single bite. It wasn't that the food was bad, it was flawless. It was that there was no soul in it, no comfort, no warmth. That was when Evelyn remembered something simple, the way her children used to fall ill with the flu when they were young. She couldn't afford doctors then. She couldn't afford much of anything. But she had something else, her hands, her heart, and her kitchen. She would make them soup, broth that simmered all day, filled with vegetables and love, the kind of meal that didn't just warm the stomach but healed something deeper. So she rolled up her sleeves and began to cook, not with expensive ingredients, not with precision like the mansion's chefs, but with care. She chopped carrots and onions. She added garlic for strength, thyme for comfort, and let the soup simmer slowly, as though time itself might melt into it. When it was ready, she carried the bowl upstairs. Her steps were hesitant. Who was she, after all? Just her housekeeper. The man upstairs was a billionaire, surrounded by the world's most brilliant minds. What could she possibly offer him? But her heart wouldn't let her walk away. Richard was lying in bed, pale against the crisp white sheets. When Evelyn entered, he looked at her, his eyes suspicious. He was used to doctors and nurses, people in uniforms, carrying charts and equipment. But here was Evelyn, carrying nothing more than a steaming bowl of soup. "What's that?" His voice rasped, barely audible. "Just something I made in the kitchen," Evelyn said softly. "Homemade soup. It might help." He frowned. He had eaten in the finest restaurants in Paris, Tokyo, and New York. He had chefs who trained for decades to perfect their craft. And yet, here was his housekeeper, offering him something so simple, so ordinary. For a moment, pride and skepticism battled within him. Why should he, a man who could summon the best of everything, accept this humble gesture? But Evelyn didn't flinch. She set the bowl gently on the nightstand and said, "You don't have to, Mr. Alston, but it's here if you want it." She didn't push. She didn't lecture. She simply left the warmth of the bowl beside him and sat quietly in the corner of the room. Minutes passed. Richard's eyes flicked toward the soup. He could smell it, earthy, rich, familiar in a way that surprised him. Slowly, with trembling hands, he reached for the spoon. His first sip was cautious, almost mechanical, but then something shifted. It wasn't the taste, though it was good. It was the memory it stirred, buried deep inside, of simpler times, long before billion-dollar deals and cold, lonely nights in skyscrapers. Times when his own mother would bring him soup when he was sick. Times when care was not a transaction, but a gift. Richard looked at Evelyn. She didn't meet his eyes, didn't hover, didn't seek his approval. She simply folded the laundry she had brought with her, humming softly under her breath. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he didn't feel like a patient or a client. He felt like a human being. That night, he finished the bowl, and though his condition didn't change overnight, something small and invisible began to shift. Over the next few days, Evelyn continued. She didn't bring him medicine, charts, or reports. She brought him stories. She told him about her children, how she worked 3 jobs to put them through school, how her youngest son used to draw pictures on the walls, how she laughed and cried through the storms of life. Sometimes, she would sit by his bed and read aloud from the Bible, or from a simple novel she kept tucked in her apron pocket. Other times, she would just hold his hand when the pain was sharp, saying nothing at all, just letting her presence remind him he wasn't alone. To the doctors, it seemed insignificant. They didn't even notice her, slipping in after they left. To Richard's family, it was invisible, but to Richard himself, it was the only thing that reached him, because in Evelyn's kindness, he began to remember what it felt like to be cared for, not because of his wealth, not because of what he could offer, but simply because he was human. Sometimes, healing doesn't begin with medicine. Sometimes, it begins with love. And so, the billionaire who had everything began to rediscover life through the quiet kindness of the one person no one had noticed. What do you think? Can the tiniest act of kindness, a bowl of soup, a hand held in silence, really change a life? At first, Evelyn's presence went unnoticed. The doctors came and went, leaving behind their carefully worded reports and their expensive prescriptions. Richard's family members gathered in hushed clusters in the hallway, speaking in tones of worry and pride, always circling around one word: money. Could more of it solve this problem? Could another machine, another treatment, another specialist be bought to fix what was broken? But slowly, whispers began. One evening, Richard's daughter stepped into his room just as Evelyn was setting down a fresh bowl of soup. The young woman froze, her eyes narrowing at the sight. "What are you doing in here?" she asked sharply. Evelyn straightened. "Just bringing something to eat, ma'am. My father doesn't need this," she said with a wave of her manicured hand. "He needs real treatment. We're paying for the best doctors in the world. Please don't interfere." Evelyn nodded quietly, bowing her head. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply stepped back, leaving the bowl behind. But the sting of those words followed her down the hallway. Interfere. As though kindness were a disruption. As though caring was a crime. The doctors, too, dismissed her. Once, one of them noticed a tray of soup and chuckled under his breath. "Comfort food," he said lightly. "Might as well give him fairy dust. He needs science, not sentiment." Richard heard that, and though he didn't say anything, something in him tightened. A part of him wanted to agree. He had built his empire on numbers, on logic, on results. He was a man who believed in power and precision, not in fragile things like kindness. So why did he keep waiting for Evelyn each night? The answer frightened him, because with every story she told, every quiet presence she offered, he felt a stirring he couldn't explain. His body was failing, yes, but his spirit, for the first time in years, felt less heavy. Still, the doubts gnawed at him. One night, after Evelyn had read to him for nearly an hour, Richard turned his head on the pillow and whispered, "Why do you do this? Why waste your time? I'm not worth it." Evelyn paused, closing the book softly. Her voice was steady, gentle. "Because everyone is worth it, Mr. Alston. You don't have to earn kindness, you just have to let it in." Her words unsettled him. In his world, everything had a price. Deals were struck, loyalty was bought, success was measured. And yet, here was a woman offering something priceless, expecting nothing in return. The family didn't see it that way. They grew restless, impatient. "The doctors are the only chance," they argued. "Stop wasting his time with stories and soup." Evelyn listened, her heart heavy but unbroken. She had lived long enough to know that kindness is often misunderstood. People dismiss it because it isn't loud, it isn't flashy, it doesn't look powerful, and yet, it has the strength to shift mountains within the soul. Richard, too, struggled with doubt. Could it be that what kept him alive these extra days wasn't the finest medicine, but the simple presence of a housekeeper? Could it be that the world he had built, all marble and glass and gold, was less nourishing than a bowl of soup made with care? The questions haunted him, and as the days went on, the resistance grew louder. The doctors pressed harder, suggesting more invasive treatments, more drastic measures. The family urged Richard to trust science, to ignore distractions. And yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when the machines beeped and the air felt thick with despair, Richard would glance at the chair by his bed. Evelyn would be there, sometimes dozing lightly, sometimes holding his hand, and he began to realize that when the world dismissed her, when they questioned her, when they told her to stop, she never faltered. Her kindness was not conditional, it was not fragile, it held steady even under doubt. But that didn't mean the weight of skepticism didn't leave scars. Evelyn would retreat to the small servants' quarters at the end of the night, sit on the edge of her bed, and wonder if she was truly helping. She thought of her children, of the long years she had worked unnoticed, of how invisible kindness often is. She prayed quietly, asking for strength to continue, even when no one believed in her. Richard, too, wrestled with the storm. He had lived a life built on control, yet here he was, powerless. He didn't know if Evelyn's kindness would save him. He didn't know if it was foolish to believe in it. But he did know one thing, in her presence, he no longer felt like he was dying alone. And sometimes, that was enough. It began with something so small, most would have overlooked it. Richard sat up in bed one morning, unaided, and asked for the curtains to be opened. It had been weeks since he had cared to see the sunlight. The doctors noticed, of course, but chalked it up to a fleeting surge of strength. Evelyn knew better. She had been there the night before, telling him a story about her daughter's first piano recital, how nervous the child had been, how her hands shook, how the audience seemed impossibly large. Evelyn described how she had whispered to her daughter, "Play for me, sweetheart. Don't think about them, just play for me." And the little girl had smiled and begun to play, each note steadier than the last. Richard had listened quietly, eyes closed, and in that story, something stirred, a reminder that fear could be faced, that weakness didn't mean defeat, and that sometimes all you need is one person believing in you. The next morning, he wanted light. From there, the ripples spread. He began eating again, not the gourmet meals prepared by the chefs, but the bowls of soup Evelyn brought him. His appetite slowly returned. His strength began to creep back in small increments. The machines beeped less frantically. His voice, once reduced to a whisper, gained a touch more power. The doctors were perplexed. A minor improvement, they called it, explaining it away with theories and medical jargon. But those who watched closely knew something deeper was happening, because it wasn't just his body that was changing, it was his heart. Richard, the man once known for his cold commands and distant demeanor, began to listen. He began to speak softly, not to demand, but to ask. He asked Evelyn about her children, her struggles, her joys. He asked her what faith meant to her, why she believed kindness mattered in a world that often overlooked it, and Evelyn answered with the same honesty and humility she always had. She told him about nights when she had worked herself to exhaustion, yet still came home and made dinner for her family. She told him about times she had been ignored, belittled, or dismissed because of who she was, but chose compassion instead of bitterness. She told him that kindness was not weakness, but strength, a strength that endures long after power fades. Richard listened, really listened, and something within him softened, like ice beginning to melt under the sun. Soon, the ripple effects began to reach others. One of the nurses noticed the bowls of soup being eaten clean and asked Evelyn for the recipe. A chef, overhearing Richard compliment Evelyn's cooking, volunteered to prepare it himself the next day, not as a duty, but as an offering. And when Richard praised him, the chef's eyes lit with pride in a way no paycheck had ever given him. The family, too, began to notice changes. Though skeptical at first, they couldn't deny the subtle transformation. Richard was no longer a man resigned to death. He was engaging, smiling faintly, even laughing on rare occasions when Evelyn told a funny story about her grandchildren. The sound of laughter in that cold, sterile mansion was like the first song of spring after a harsh winter. And then came the moment that surprised everyone. One afternoon, Richard asked for a pen and paper. His hands shook, but he managed to scrawl a few sentences. He asked Evelyn to read it back to him. It was a note, not a business contract, not a legal document, but a letter of gratitude. He wanted to thank her for her kindness, for her presence, for her simple humanity. Evelyn's eyes blurred with tears as she read the words aloud. In all her years in the Austen household, she had never once been acknowledged in such a way. For decades, she had worked quietly, invisibly, and now here was the master of the house saying thank you. 2 small words, yet to her, they carried the weight of a lifetime. But the ripple didn't stop there. The family, once focused only on wealth and treatments, began to notice Evelyn differently. They saw the way Richard's eyes softened when she entered the room, the way his body seemed to relax in her presence. They began to realize that her impact wasn't in opposition to the doctor's efforts, but in harmony with them. Where science had limits, kindness filled the gaps. Even the doctors, though reluctant, began to acknowledge the change. Whatever you're doing, keep it up, one said with a half smile, though he still couched it in medical language. And yet, the truth was plain. Evelyn's compassion had awakened something in Richard that medicine alone could not reach. It's easy to think kindness is small, too fragile to make a difference in a world built on power and wealth. But like a single drop in water, its ripples spread farther than we ever imagine. Richard was proof of that. From the sunlight he asked to see, to the food he began to eat, to the laughter that returned to his lips, all of it traced back to a woman who dared to believe that love could heal what money could not. And so, the mansion that once echoed with silence began to hum with something new. Not machines, not arguments, not despair, but hope. And hope, once it takes root, spreads like wildfire. Just when it seemed hope was returning, the storm came. One night, long after the doctors had left and the house had gone quiet, Richard's breathing grew ragged, his chest heaved, his skin grew clammy, and the machines beside him erupted with frantic beeps. Evelyn rushed to his side, her hands trembling as she pressed the call button for help. Within minutes, the room flooded with doctors and nurses. Orders were barked, syringes prepared, machines adjusted. Richard groaned in pain, his eyes rolling back, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt powerless. She stood in the corner, clutching her apron, watching as the professionals did everything they could. But amid the chaos, one voice cut through, sharp, dismissive. Out, one of the doctors snapped, pointing at Evelyn. This is no place for you. You're in the way. Her heart ached, but she obeyed. She stepped into the hallway, her back against the cold marble wall, listening to the frantic rhythm of footsteps and commands inside the room. Minutes stretched into eternity. Memories flashed before her eyes, her children when they were young, her long years of quiet service in this house, the way Richard had begun to smile again, to live again. Had it all been for nothing? Was this the end, despite everything? Inside, Richard's family panicked. Do something, his daughter cried. Save him. But the doctors shook their heads grimly. They were doing all they could. And then, silence. The machines calmed. Richard, though pale and weak, began to breathe more evenly. The immediate crisis had passed. Relief swept through the room like a tide. The doctors exhaled, exchanging nods. "Stabilizing," one of them murmured. But to Evelyn, who lingered in the hall, it felt like a cruel reminder. She had no place here. She was not a doctor. She could not save him when the crisis struck. Her kindness, in the eyes of others, was nothing compared to medicine and machines. When she was finally allowed back in, Richard was barely conscious. His eyelids fluttered, and his lips moved faintly. Evelyn leaned close, straining to hear. "Don't leave me," he whispered. The words pierced her heart. In that fragile moment, stripped of pride and pretense, Richard revealed what no machine could measure: the fear of being alone. Evelyn took his hand, holding it gently. "I'm here," she said softly. "I won't leave you." But the family's patience had worn thin. Later that night, Richard's son confronted her in the hallway. "You need to stop," he said firmly. "This storytelling, this soup, this sitting by his side, it's distracting him. It's making him weak. My father needs to focus on fighting, not on listening to fairy tales." Evelyn met his eyes, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Your father doesn't just need medicine, he needs love. Without that, no amount of treatment will save him." The son scoffed. "You're a housekeeper, not a doctor. Know your place." The words stung. She had heard them before in different forms throughout her life, the reminder that she was invisible, unimportant, unqualified. And yet, deep down, she knew the truth. She had seen the light return to Richard's eyes. She had seen his laughter, his gratitude. She knew her presence mattered, even if no one else believed it. Still, doubt crept in. That night, in the solitude of her small room, Evelyn wept. She asked herself if she was clinging to hope in vain. Perhaps kindness really wasn't enough. Perhaps the world was right, that money and power and science were the only forces that mattered. But then she remembered Richard's words, "Don't leave me." Those 3 words were more powerful than any medical report. They were proof that what she offered was not meaningless. It was essential. The next morning, Evelyn returned to Richard's side, her spirit weary but unbroken. She brought no soup, no stories, only herself. She sat in the chair, took his hand, and simply stayed. The family frowned. The doctors ignored her, but Richard's fingers curled faintly around hers, as though anchoring himself to her presence. And though the storm had passed, everyone in that mansion knew the truth. The battle was far from over. The crisis had shaken their fragile hope, tested their faith and kindness, and left them wondering whether it could survive the storms yet to come. So let me ask you this: if you were Evelyn, standing in the face of doubt, dismissal, and despair, would you still choose kindness? The crisis had shaken everyone in the mansion. For days afterward, the air was tense, as though the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for the next collapse. The doctors doubled down on their treatments, prescribing new combinations of medicines and monitoring Richard with sharp, watchful eyes. The family hovered constantly, their faces etched with fear and impatience. And yet, amid all the tension, Evelyn remained steady. She didn't argue with the doctors. She didn't confront the family. She simply showed up, with quiet strength, with gentle words, with a kind of presence that asked for nothing and gave everything. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a quiet afternoon, the sky outside heavy with rain. Richard lay in bed, his breathing shallow, his face pale. Evelyn sat beside him, her fingers wrapped lightly around his hand. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rain tapping against the glass and the steady hum of the machines. Finally, Richard opened his eyes. They were weaker than before, but there was a clarity in them that hadn't been there in months. "Evelyn," he whispered. She leaned closer. "I'm here." He swallowed with difficulty, then said words that surprised even himself. "All my life, I thought money could buy me everything. Health, happiness, even love. But lying here, I see the truth. None of it matters without people who care." Tears stung Evelyn's eyes, but she remained calm, listening. You cared when no one else did," Richard continued, his voice breaking. "Not for what I had, not for what I could give. You cared, because I was human, and I don't know how to thank you." Evelyn squeezed his hand, her voice gentle. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Alston. That's what kindness is. It asks for nothing. It just gives." Richard closed his eyes, but this time not on despair. It was as though a weight had lifted, a burden of decades slipping away. For the first time in his long, powerful life, he let himself be vulnerable, and in that vulnerability, he found peace. Something remarkable happened in the days that followed. His body, once failing, began to recover with unexpected strength. The doctors could only shake their heads in disbelief, calling it a rare turnaround or a statistical anomaly. But everyone who had watched Evelyn by his side knew the truth. Healing had begun in his spirit, and the body had followed. Richard began to talk more, his voice steadying with each day. He asked Evelyn to read to him not only her stories but also the newspaper, novels, even poetry. He wanted to fill his mind with life again. One evening, as Evelyn read aloud by lamplight, Richard interrupted her with a faint smile. "You know what I've realized? For years, I built empires but never built relationships. I bought everything but never earned love. But you've given me something money can't buy." "What's that?" Evelyn asked softly. "Time. Time worth living." The words hung in the room like a blessing. Evelyn felt her heart swell with quiet joy. She had not healed him with medicine, but with presence, compassion, and the courage to treat him not as a billionaire, but as a man. The transformation spread. Richard's children, who had once dismissed Evelyn, began to watch their father change. He asked them questions about their lives, their dreams, things he had never bothered with before. He apologized, words they had never expected to hear. At first, they were stunned, unsure how to respond. But as the days passed, walls that had stood for years began to crack. Conversations grew warmer. The mansion, once a place of cold wealth, began to glow with something far richer. Even the staff, who had always worked in silence, felt the shift. Richard began greeting them, thanking them. His words were halting at first, but sincere. For some, it was the first time in decades they had heard acknowledgement from the man they served, and that acknowledgement, simple, heartfelt, was enough to make them stand taller, smile brighter. Kindness had done what money could not. It had humanized Richard Alston. By the end of the month, he was strong enough to sit in a chair by the window. Evelyn stood beside him as he looked out at the city skyline, the towers and streets that had once been nothing more than battlegrounds for his ambition. This time, he saw them differently. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to look at this city and see opportunity, competition, power. Now, I just see people, millions of people, each with their own struggles, their own pain, and I wonder, how many of them need what you gave me? Not money, but kindness." Evelyn smiled. "More than you think, sir, more than you think." And in that moment, Richard Alston was transformed, not cured by wealth, not saved by power, but reborn through the quiet, steadfast compassion of one woman who refused to let him face his suffering alone. So I ask you, how would you feel, knowing that your small gesture, your simple act of kindness, transformed someone's entire world? Weeks turned into months, and the mansion that had once felt like a mausoleum of wealth began to feel like a home again. Richard was no longer the silent figure confined to a bed, fading away under the watchful eyes of 10 specialists. He was alive, not just breathing, but living. And it wasn't because of a breakthrough treatment or a medical miracle. It was because one woman had dared to care. Evelyn's role in the household shifted in quiet, unexpected ways. She was still the housekeeper, still moving through the halls with her steady hands and humble heart. But something had changed. She was no longer invisible. She was seen. When she entered a room, Richard's children greeted her by name. The staff, once resigned to working in the shadows, began to share smiles and stories with her. The ripple of her kindness had broken through the walls of hierarchy and pride, reminding everyone that humanity lives beneath every title, every role. Richard himself was different. He still carried the weight of his years, the consequences of his choices, but he carried them with a new spirit. He spoke to his children with tenderness, reaching for bonds he had once neglected. He asked forgiveness more often, and though forgiveness is never simple, his effort planted seeds of healing in his family. One evening, he sat with Evelyn by the fire, a blanket draped over his knees. "Do you know," he said softly, "the magazines still call it a miracle? They write about the 10 doctors, about the treatments, about science pulling me back from the edge. But you and I know the truth, don't we?" Evelyn smiled gently. "We do. Healing begins with the heart." Richard nodded, his eyes glistening. "I used to think legacy was about skyscrapers, companies, fortunes, but maybe legacy is about moments, about the lives we touch when we don't have to." It was a lesson Evelyn had known all along. She had not come into the Alston household seeking recognition or reward. She had simply lived her truth. That kindness, even in its smallest form, carries power. And now, that truth had changed a billionaire's life. The legacy stretched further than either of them imagined. Inspired by his transformation, Richard began funding community programs, not for publicity, but from a genuine desire to give back. He asked Evelyn's advice on which causes mattered most, listening as she spoke of struggling single mothers, of children in need of school supplies, of families who needed more compassion than cash. For the first time in his life, his wealth became a tool not for empire, but for empathy. The newspapers still told their version of the story, the brilliant doctors, the unexpected recovery, the marvel of medicine. But those who had been inside the mansion knew the truth. They had seen the ripple effects themselves. They had felt them, and in quiet ways, those ripples continued. The nurse who had once scoffed at the soup began cooking for her own patients, offering them warmth alongside their medicine. The chef, once focused only on perfection, began preparing meals with more heart, seeing food as comfort instead of art. Even Richard's daughter, who had once dismissed Evelyn, began to stop by her side, asking for advice on motherhood. Humility softened in her once proud tone. This is the legacy of kindness. It multiplies, it moves, it lingers long after the moment has passed. Evelyn never sought recognition. She never told her story to the papers. To most of the world, her name would remain unknown. But in the quiet corners of that mansion, and in the heart of a man who once believed himself untouchable, she left an imprint no fortune could erase. Richard Alston lived longer than the doctors had predicted, long enough to reconcile with his family, long enough to turn some of his wealth into genuine good, long enough to look out his glass windows not with loneliness, but with gratitude. And when the day finally came for him to leave this world, he did so not as a man clinging to power, but as a man who had learned the truth. The greatest wealth we can ever hold is the kindness we give and receive. And Evelyn? She continued her life much the same way she always had, quietly, humbly, faithfully. For her, kindness was never about recognition. It was about living true to who she was. But those who knew the story, those who had watched it unfold, carried her example with them forever. So now, as this story closes, I want to leave you with this thought: kindness doesn't need to be grand to be life-changing. It doesn't take riches, or fame, or brilliance. Sometimes, it takes nothing more than a bowl of soup, a steady hand, or the courage to sit with someone in their darkest hour. That is the power you hold, right now, today. If this story touched you, I invite you to subscribe, not just to support this channel, but to spread stories like this further into the world. And more than that, I'd love for you to share in the comments, what's a moment of kindness you've given or received that stayed with you? Your story could inspire someone else to keep going, to keep caring, to keep believing, because in the end, that's what this world needs more than anything: the courage to be kind.